Hey there, Drawyah here, and welcome to the Microsoft Flight Simulator. In this video, we shall be going through a tutorial setup of the Airbus A320neo, going through its entire cold and dark process from FMS Config, pushback and engine start, taxi, and takeoff. We shall also be using SimBrief for our management computer setup, and so, if you don't know what that is, or don't have a flight plan ready to follow along, I'd highly recommend you watch the video in the top right corner of the screen first, where I go through flight plan setup. Now, without further ado, let's jump up into the cockpit and let's start preparing this flight. The first thing you'll want to do is head to the overhead panel and turn on both batteries. If the master warning alarm sounds, press the button here to clear it. Head back to the overhead panel, turn on the external power, turn on the fuel pumps, set the navigation lights to on, and set the strobes to automatic. Once you have done this, you will now start the flight management computer setup. The first thing you want to do is set up the initialization. This is where we plug in our departure airport and arrival airports, as well as our cost index and cruising altitude. Our flight today takes from London Heathrow to Helsinki, so the ICO code for London Heathrow is Echo Golf Lima Lima. We put a slash in place to split up the two chunks of information. As you can see, we have one block of info, a slash, a second block of info, and here we then plug in Helsinki's ICO code of Echo Foxtrot Hotel Kilo. Plug that in. We don't have a company route, and therefore we can go return straight back to the page. And next, plug in our cost index. According to SimBrief, that is 29, and therefore plug 29 into the console and insert it there. Cruising altitude today is at 350, flight level 350, 35,000 feet, and therefore we'll insert that into the FMS. And sometimes it will automatically fill one, but in this case it's incorrect, and therefore we'll fill in our updated cruising altitude. Next, we then go to the second page of initialization, and this we plug in our zero fuel weight, our center of gravity, and our block fuel on board. In regards to the center of gravity, this is something you actually want to do way back into the aircraft loading menu. And so what you want to do is over to the weight and balance page, set up your fuel, set up your payload, in which we actually probably decrease it slightly. And what you then want to do is look up here to the top right. So as you can see, center of gravity right now is at 20.71. So this here is the value that you'll be uploading into the FMS. With that in mind, we'll now start filling in this page. Once again, we have two blocks of information for the zero fuel weight and zero fuel weight center of gravity, with a slash in the middle splitting it. The zero fuel weight is generally correct from the get-go, and therefore we'll plug that into the FMS, 50.2. We'll then put a slash, and our center of gravity, as we know from the main menu, was 20.71. So we'll insert that now into the FMS, and insert it in place. Our block fuel, our total fuel on boards, we can find that over here, the fuel on board panel. Instead of 10.6 tons of fuel on board, we actually have 9.3. So we'll go back to the FMS and plug in 9.36 and paste that into the block fuel. With the initialization now plugged in, we can head over to the flight plan and start sorting out our routing. When it comes to our route, there are two types of nodes you need to be aware of: waypoints and airways. A waypoint is a designated coordinate set via a VOR tower, and what this does is determine the direction the aircraft will fly before turning left and right. And so, an airplane will daisy chain along different VOR points and fly, in this case, VOR to VOR. An airway is an airplane right of way, and so it determines the direction to travel between the two waypoints, and in the case of avoiding certain airspace or avoiding other traffic patterns, this will add extra waypoints just to snake around these as you fly along your routes. Start plugging our waypoints, we'll head over to the first node, which is at Heathrow Airport. We'll then head to the airways page, where we can start plugging everything in. First of all, we'll start with our first waypoint, Bravo Papa Kilo, BPK, and plug that into the 2 points. In some cases, you'll have multiple options between waypoints, and so what you need to do is either use the flight plan to decide where it is, or in the case of this one, it's relatively easy to judge as flying through London, we're in the northern hemisphere, not the southern, and since the first and last points are exactly the same, we can select either of those and it shall be correct. Next we have an airway, Quebec 295, so we'll insert that into the FMS 295 and set it in the via point. Nothing's happened, but it hasn't told us it's incorrect, and therefore we can continue the flight plan and it will appear. Next waypoint, we fly to Somva. Plug that in. And next waypoint, or airway even, of up 155. Plug that in. And this time, the AirSet is not in database. So the AirX cycle and navigation in Microsoft Flight Simulator, I have noticed that, for the most part, waypoints are all correct and they're correct locations. You have no problems with these whatsoever. Airways, you do get the odd one missing, but for the most part, it should be alright as well. Perhaps an AirX cycle would come in handy when updating navigation in the future. So we'll clear that and plug in our next waypoint of Mavas. After Mavas, we fly DCT to Tuska. DCT meaning direct, so there's no airway in that selection. We skip that and go straight to the next waypoint, which is Tuska. After Tuska, we fly direct again to Ririp. And since we've now run out of space on this first page, we can temporarily insert, and also you can see Quebec 295 has been found, so we can insert that. Scroll down to the end of the flight plan, and we have one more waypoint to add, which is Lakats. So we'll add that to the Ririp point. And set it to the next waypoint. Insert that, and our flight plan is complete. If your flight plan was longer, you just go to the next waypoint, add it, next waypoint, add it, so forth, until your flight plan is complete. At this stage, it will also be worth checking your flight plan on the ND there, the navigation display. Set it to plan mode, and zoom out to a range where you can see a lot of the route ahead of you. In the A320neo, you can then use the up and down arrows to go through each waypoint step by step. So as you can see, our routing is complete with no breaks, and flies a relatively straight line path to Helsinki. With that in mind, we can reset that, and head back to Heathrow. We now need to set our departure point, our SID, our Standard Instrument Departure. A SID is a predefined route out of an airport that is used to control air traffic in and out of the airspace while avoiding aircraft coming into land. It also allows for separation and splits the aircraft up depending on which direction they need to fly in. Currently, the active runway in Heathrow is runway 27 right, so we'll insert that. And our departure is via the Bravo Papa Kilo 7 Foxtrot, which is over here. With that in place, we can now insert the flight plan. As you can see, it has now added a few extra waypoints to our initial departure. So if we go back to plan mode, if we zoom in to the ND there, we can now see we've got a lot more guidance on our initial departure heading to the northeast before flying to our initial waypoint of Bravo Papa Kilo, which is currently here. Now that our flight plan is complete, we can return back to arc mode, set the ND to a zoom level that you'd quite like. In my case, I'm going to set to 20 mile range, and we can now start setting up the autopilot panel. Our initialization and flight plans are now set. There is one last thing that you need to do to the flight management computer, and that is set up the performance. What this does is determine your aircraft's takeoff capabilities. When it comes to calculating the flex to temp, I use this tool here by David Katona, and so while built specifically for the FS Labs 320, it is all the same aircraft at the end of the day, and therefore should work regardless. So the first thing you want to do is select the aircraft type, being the A320, and the engines, being CFMs. This is calculating off the CFM52s and not the LEAP 1As that the Neo uses, but they are very similar engines and therefore shouldn't cause too much of a disparity in calculation. Next come to units, this being the metric, and our origin airport, which is Heathrow at Echo Golf Lima Lima. We'll then click on the meta. What that will do is put all the active weather information here in London right now. And what we then do is select our flaps using flaps 1. You can use 2 if you want to, but for the most part you'll be using 1. packs will be on, anti-icing off on a dry runway. Next, select the active runway, which currently is 27 left with the winds at 240, and then click on calculate. What that will do is calculate the flex at 37,000 plus 4 and the temp flex max at 67. And so when plugging in the FMS, you'll be using 67 as your flex max. With that in mind, we can now start programming this plate. First we have the V speeds, takeoff speeds, and these are automatically set. These are generally correct for what they are, and therefore we can leave those alone. Next it comes to transition altitude, and this is where you switch from local altimeter to standard altimeter, which is 29902 inches or 1013 hectopascals. Within the UK, transition altitude is 6000, and therefore we shall be updating that. Next we come to our flaps and THS deflection speeds, and once again this is a slash point as you have two nodes to fill in separately. THS deflection speed is not yet functional on Microsoft Flight Simulator, and therefore this is something that you can just ignore. Flaps set to 1 as you did from the calculator before, stroke 0 and plug that in, and then flex temp as we know is at 67, plug that in, and with that our flight management computer setup is now complete. We can leave this in the takeoff page until we're in the air, and so we can head back to the main panel and go over to the autopilot configuration. The first thing you want to do is set the altitude to the cruising altitude of your flight. In my case it's flight level 350 or 35,000 feet. So we'll set that and the aircraft will automatically climb based on the different altitudes. Next we'll set the local QNH, which within European airspace or the majority of the world you'll be doing in hectopascals. In the US you do measure your air pressure in mercury, and that will be measured in inches, but for the rest of the world you'll be using QNH hectopascals, and so we'll be setting that to 1008, as you remember from the METAR information when pulling the FMS data. Finally, we'll turn on our flight director, and with that, our FMS setup and autopilot is now complete. Since we are getting nearer to engine push and start, head back to the overhead panel, and we'll now start up the auxiliary power units, the APU. So turn on the master switch and turn on the starter, and slowly this will turn on. By turning on the auxiliary power unit, it turns on a small engine at the back of the aeroplane, which will power the onboard systems, and therefore we can disconnect from external power and start preparing the aircraft for push and start. We'll give that a few seconds to warm up. You'll slowly hear the engine turn on in the background. And as soon as in the cockpit the available light appears on the overheads, you can now turn on the APU bleed. So APU is running, bleeds are running, you can turn off the external power, and you'll now be able to start hearing the bleed air systems power within the aircraft. Finally, we are ready for push and start, and therefore we can head over to the beacon lights and switch that on to alert ground crews that we are now ready to turn on our engines, and this will start enabling them to clear up the ground around the aircrafts and prepare the pushback target into place for startup. Calling the pushback target is easy. All you have to do is press Shift P on the keyboard, and that will slowly move into place. As that connects to the aircraft, the jet bridge will automatically move away from the airplane, and therefore that's one less process you need to do. The pushback target will make a connection to the aeroplane, and as soon as it adds tension to the nose gear, it will then be releasing the parking brake. There we go. Release the brakes, it's down to the ignition panel, and sets the switch to the right for engine start. With that in place, we'll now start up engine number 1. The Airbus A320neo is capable of dual engine starts, but perhaps this tutorial we'll be doing one after the other. And so, within the Airbus aircraft, you always start engine 1 then 2, as this determines which hydraulic systems will be reactive in the aeroplane. And so, you want some on first to start pumping the aircraft up, including the hydraulic and PTU, before starting up the other. Also now press the aircraft to steer to the right. And now move the aeroplane in line with the taxi line. It does take a few tries to practice actually pushing back and getting the aeroplane to push back correctly, but once you've done it enough times, you will start to get a feel with how to position the aeroplane for this mode. Engine number 1 is slowly starting up. The nose wheel is on the centre line, we can then stop the pushback and lock the parking brakes in place. As soon as number 1 is stable, we can start up the right hand engine, engine number 2. PT will now start as the hydraulics pump through the aeroplane. We'll lower the flaps down to 1, we'll arm the speed brakes, and then the auto braking will arm when we are short of the runway. And so the spoilers and the braking will come into play in the case of reject takeoff, therefore we can slow the airplane down quicker and therefore allow for safe operation of the airplane. Engine number 2 now slowly starting. So keep an eye on the engine setup over here on the engine display. So as you can see, 1 is stable at 19.5 and 1. Number 2 will slowly power up as it starts. As soon as number 2 is stable, we can head back to the engine panel startup, switch the ignition back to normal. At this point, we can set up the taxi lights, switch off the APU, since we are now on engine power in the aircraft. It will automatically switch between APU and engine power. Release the parking brake, increase a little bit of throttle, and taxi now to the runway. In order to steer the airplane, you can do this with the rudder control, turning left or right, as rudder or yaw are both also aligned to the nose gear with Microsoft Flight Simulator. As we approach the runway, you'll want to stop at the hold short marker just in front of it, which is the dashed line closest to the runway. What this does is it maintains separation between aircraft on the runway and those on the ground, and therefore maintains a safe distance between the airplanes around you. Cut back the throttle and hold the aircraft short. At this point, you'll be getting your air traffic control takeoff clearance, while it's performing a visual check. Make sure nobody is currently on approach on the runway, and make sure that nobody is currently on the runway, crossing, or coming in to land from the other side. With takeoff clearance in mind and your runway knowingly clear, you can switch on the landing lights, switch the taxi lights to takeoff lights. And at this stage, we can now enter the runway and get the airplane ready for takeoff. Apply a little bit of throttle to enter the runway, and do be in mind that at some airports where there is high traffic levels, you potentially want to do this a little bit quicker than you're taxiing at, just to ensure that you can get the aircraft in the air in time for the next airplane to land. We shall center the airplane on the runway. And just before we start our takeoff run, we'll bring the airplane to a halt. Do a quick check to make sure that the spoilers are armed, flaps are set, and the maximum brakes are set. And at this stage, you can roll the throttles up to around 40%. Watch the N1 and 2 to make sure that both engines are stable. When you're happy, move the throttle about 80% of the way forwards until you get to the second click for flex, which in this case is 67. The auto throttle will also turn itself on, and therefore, as soon as the aircraft's airborne, then be able to lift off. Hold the throttle down. Hold the stick down, sorry. B1, rotate. Ensure that the aircraft has positive climb before you raise the gear. As we hit 200 knots, we'll bring the throttle back to climb power. Enough speed, we'll raise the flaps up to the upward position. So make a right hand turn to follow the initial heading out. As soon as we're at a safe speed and at safe altitude, we'll then be able to switch on the autopilot and allow the aircraft to fly its routing. So, autopilot on, and push on the heading and speed mode, as well as the altitude. And there we have it. Our Airbus A320 is now airborne and on its way to Helsinki. So, I hope you found this tutorial helpful in learning the startup process of the A320neo with Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I hope that you do find it useful in taking aircraft up in flight on your own. The A320neo is certainly a nimble little aircraft, and for jet commercial travel, it's certainly a popular one, and therefore I'm sure this aircraft will be heavily used in the simulator, as well as some third-party add-ons to arrive. So, I hope you guys have enjoyed the watch. Do leave a like for the video if you did enjoy it, do subscribe as well if you found it helpful, and do also share it around and share with your friends to teach them how to fly the A320. Thank you all very much for watching, and see you guys next time. Take care, and goodbye.